On March 8, 2026, while American and Israeli bombs were falling on Tehran, 88 Iranian clerics gathered in haste to do something no one had done in 47 years of the Islamic Republic's existence: choose a new supreme leader in the middle of an active war. They voted online. They voted under pressure. And at the exact moment the ballots were being counted, an Israeli missile struck the building of their own council in the city of Qom. The new supreme leader of Iran was the son of the assassinated Ayatollah. Trump called him a lightweight. Israel declared him a legitimate target for elimination. And he himself vanished. No one had seen him since February 28th. The CIA did not know where he was. And this man, invisible, unknown, a man who had never held a single official government position, now held in his hands the nuclear program, the army, and the future of 90 million people.
But here is what we are going to answer in this video. Why had Western intelligence services spent years building a file on him and still called him a black box? How did a man with no public speeches, no official titles, no visible record become the most powerful person in the country? Why did the Revolutionary Guard force him onto the throne over far more senior and credible clerics in the middle of a war? And most importantly, is he more dangerous than his father? Because according to available assessments, his position on nuclear weapons is considerably harder than anything Ayatollah Ali Khamenei ever held. All of that in this breakdown. If you want to understand the intelligence operations and power struggles the world is still trying to decode, subscribe and hit the bell. Every day we cover the stories that headlines don't have time to explain. To understand who Mujtaba Khamenei is and why his rise to power matters more than almost anyone in Western capitals is willing to say out loud, you first need to understand what made him so extraordinarily difficult to read. Not just for ordinary Iranians, not just for journalists, but for the CIA, for Mossad, and for every intelligence service that spent years trying to build a complete picture of the man who was, for decades, the most influential private figure inside the Islamic Republic. Most political figures leave traces. They give speeches, they publish positions, they attend press conferences, make statements, appear at official functions. The record they create, intentionally or not, becomes the raw material that analysts use to reconstruct their thinking, map their networks, and predict their behavior. It is imperfect work, but it is work that can be done because the material exists. With Mujtaba Khamenei, almost none of that material existed. For decades, he operated with a deliberateness that was almost without parallel in modern Iranian politics. He gave no public lectures, he delivered no Friday sermons, he made no political addresses, he granted no interviews, he held no press conferences. There was, until very recently, no publicly available footage of him speaking at all. In a political system built around clerical authority expressed through public religious discourse, this silence was not accidental. It was architectural. A man who never speaks publicly cannot be quoted, cannot be pinned to a position, cannot be held accountable for a statement. A man who never appears in an official capacity cannot be challenged on the basis of his record. He becomes, in the language of intelligence analysis, a black box, a system whose inputs and outputs can be observed, but whose internal logic remains opaque. Western diplomats had a different phrase for it. Leaked American cables published by WikiLeaks in the late 2000s referred to Mujtaba Khamenei as the power behind the robes. That phrase was not casual. It reflected something that American intelligence had concluded through years of painstaking signals collection, human reporting, and behavioral analysis. That this man, who held no title, who appeared at no official functions, who had never been elected or appointed to anything, was nonetheless one of the primary architects of Iranian state power. He controlled access to his father. He shaped decisions that were announced under his father's name. He built and cultivated networks inside the Revolutionary Guard that answered, through layers of institutional structure, ultimately to him. And he did all of it without ever once appearing on a podium. That invisibility was not weakness. It was the most sophisticated form of protection available inside the Islamic Republic, a system in which official visibility brings official accountability, and official accountability brings official vulnerability. Mujtaba Khamenei had watched what happened to men who became too visible. He had watched reformists rise and be dismantled. He had watched rivals build public profiles and find those profiles turned into weapons against them. And he had drawn the obvious conclusion. The safest position in the Iranian system was the one nobody could formally target, because nobody could formally locate it. He was born on September 8, 1969, in Mashhad, the same city in northeastern Iran where his father had been born 30 years earlier, and one of the holiest sites in the Shia Muslim world, home to the shrine of Imam Reza. He was the second of Ali Khamenei's sons. He was 9 years old when the Islamic Revolution toppled the Shah's monarchy in February of 1979, and his entire conscious life unfolded inside the world that revolution created. His father moved from revolutionary activist to deputy defense minister to president to supreme leader across the first 2 decades of Mojtaba's life, a trajectory that gave the younger Khamenei access to the inner workings of revolutionary power from an age when most children were still in primary school. He attended Alavi High School in Tehran, a prestigious institution that served as a finishing school for the Islamic Republic's emerging elite. Among its graduates, former Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, and a generation of figures who would go on to occupy senior positions throughout the state apparatus. The school was not simply an academic institution. It was a network, a place where the children of the revolution's founders formed the relationships that would later define their careers inside the system. After graduating in 1987, Mujtaba did not go to university. He went to war. The Iran-Iraq War, which had been grinding for 7 years by the time Mujtaba joined the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, was in its final and most brutal phase. He was inducted into the Habib ibn Mazahir Battalion, a unit operating under the 27th Muhammad Rasulullah Division of the IRGC. He served in a non-combat capacity, logistics, coordination, support functions, but the experience gave him something that no seminary education could have provided: direct, formative relationships with the men who were becoming the backbone of Iran's security and military apparatus. His comrades in the Habib Battalion included figures who would go on to define the IRGC's power structure for the next 4 decades. Among them, Qasem Soleimani, who would eventually command the Quds Force and become the most feared Iranian military figure in the region before his assassination in January of 2020. Hossein Hamadani, who would become a senior IRGC commander, and Hossein Tayeb, who would later serve as the first head of the IRGC's intelligence organization, the parallel intelligence apparatus that Mojtaba himself would help build into a rival of the official Ministry of Intelligence. These were not casual acquaintances. These were the men Mojtaba Khamenei had stood beside on the front lines as a teenager. And in a system built on personal loyalty and shared sacrifice, those bonds carried a weight that no formal appointment could replicate. The war ended in a ceasefire in August of 1988. Mojtaba was 18. And now, with the battlefield behind him, he turned to the other pillar of authority inside the Islamic Republic, the seminary. In 1999, he moved to Qom to begin formal clerical studies. His teachers were not moderates. They were not pragmatists. They were among the most theologically radical and politically hardline clerics in Iran's entire religious establishment. Chief among them was Ayatollah Mohammad Taqi Mezba Yazdi, a figure so extreme in his views that even within Iran's conservative clerical circles he was considered a provocateur. Mezba Yazdi argued, in explicit and public terms, that the supreme leader did not require the consent of the people to govern, that democratic legitimacy was irrelevant to the exercise of Islamic authority, that opposition to the supreme leader was, in religious terms, opposition to God. He was the ideological architect of the position that power did not need to justify itself. It only needed to hold itself. Mujtaba Khamenei studied under this man. He absorbed this worldview.
And when he eventually moved from student to teacher himself, joining the Qom seminary as a theological instructor, it was this framework: authority without accountability, power without public legitimacy, that he carried with him. But here is where the story takes a turn that no intelligence briefing fully anticipated. Because everything described so far, the military background, the seminary education, the hardline theology, was, in a sense, the visible surface. The part of Mujtaba Khamenei that could be reconstructed from records, from sources, from the accumulated fragments of Iranian political reporting. Underneath it was something that Western analysts had spent years trying to map and never fully succeeded in charting: the real architecture of his power. And it was built not in the seminaries of Qom or the barracks of the IRGC, but in the most sensitive and least visible corridors of his father's office.
The office of the supreme leader. In Persian, the Beit-e-Rabari is not a simple administrative structure. It is the operational center of the entire Islamic Republic. It controls the appointment of senior military commanders. It oversees the IRGC's budget and strategic direction. It coordinates the activities of Iran's proxy network across the region. It holds final authority over every institution of significance in the state. And for years, for decades, Mujtaba Khamenei sat inside that office not as a formal official, not as an appointed deputy, but as something far more difficult to dislodge: the gatekeeper, the man who controlled access to the supreme leader himself, the man who decided who got a meeting, what information reached his father's desk, and which decisions were shaped before they ever formally arrived for approval. American intelligence had a name for this kind of figure: not a minister, not a commander, something older and more dangerous. A regent operating behind the formal structure of authority, accumulating real power while the visible architecture of the state absorbed all the scrutiny. And that power, invisible and carefully constructed across 20 years, was about to make its first public appearance in the most violent and consequential way possible. In 2005, Mujtaba Khamenei's name entered Iranian political controversy for the first time. Mehdi Karoubi, a reformist cleric and presidential candidate who had finished third in that year's election, took the extraordinary step of writing a public letter directly to the supreme leader, his own father, accusing Mujtaba of directly engineering the election result in favor of the hardline candidate Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The letter was unprecedented. No one had publicly accused the supreme leader's son of electoral manipulation before. It was the first time the name Mujtaba Khamenei had appeared in open political discourse as something other than a biographical footnote. And it revealed, for the first time, what Iranian political insiders had understood for years: that this man operated with reach and capability that extended far beyond the walls of his father's office. 4 years later, in the summer of 2009, that reach would be demonstrated in a way that made the 2005 election controversy look minor by comparison. And what happened in 2009, what Mujtaba Khamenei did in those months, the decisions he made, the forces he unleashed, is the reason that years later, Iranian protesters were chanting his name in the streets. Not in support, in fury, and in a warning that the Islamic Republic chose not to hear. The summer of 2009 was supposed to be a moment of reformist triumph.
Mir Hossein Mousavi, a moderate candidate with genuine popular support, had run a presidential campaign that electrified a generation of Iranians who had grown up inside the Islamic Republic and wanted something different from it. Not revolution, not the overthrow of the system. Something more restrained and,
in many ways more threatening to the hardliners who controlled the state. Change from within. Young Iranians flooded the streets in green, the color of Mousavi's campaign, in numbers that surprised even his own supporters. The energy was real. The expectation of victory was real. And then the results came in. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the incumbent hardline president, was declared the winner with 63% of the vote. The margin was not just large, it was statistically implausible. In some provinces, the reported turnout exceeded the number of registered voters.
In others, Mousavi, who had deep ethnic and regional roots in specific parts of the country, received fewer votes than basic demographic analysis suggested was mathematically possible. The Council of Guardians, the body responsible for certifying election results, acknowledged that discrepancies affecting millions of votes had been found, and then declared that those discrepancies were not significant enough to have changed the outcome. Iran erupted. Within days, millions of Iranians were in the streets of Tehran and other major cities, the largest protests the Islamic Republic had seen since its founding. The Green Movement, as it became known, was not a fringe phenomenon. It drew professionals, students, clerics, bazaar merchants, women in and out of headscarves, men who had fought in the Iran-Iraq War and now found themselves marching against the government they had once defended. It was, by any honest measure, a crisis of legitimacy for the Islamic Republic at the deepest level. The regime's response was not negotiation. It was not concession. It was not even the kind of managed acknowledgement of grievances that authoritarian governments sometimes deploy to release pressure before it becomes explosive. The response was violence. Organized, systematic, and directed from the very top of the security apparatus. And according to every serious account of what happened in those months, from Iranian opposition sources, from Western intelligence assessments, from the reconstructed record of decisions made inside the Beit-e-Rabari, the man who coordinated that response, who directed the besieged paramilitary forces into the streets, who oversaw the mass arrests and the detention facilities where protesters were held and, in documented cases, tortured and killed, was Mujtaba Khamenei. The Basij, the volunteer paramilitary militia that operates under the organizational umbrella of the IRGC, had, by 2009, come under the effective operational control of Mujtaba through his network of loyalists inside the force's command structure. His connection to Hossein Tayyab, his former comrade from the Habib battalion who had by then risen to command the besieged forces, was the operational link that made this possible. Tayyab and Mujtaba had stood together as teenagers on the front lines of the Iran-Iraq War. 2 decades later, Tayyab commanded the force that Mujtaba now directed against his own country's citizens. The crackdown was brutal by any standard. Dozens of protesters were killed in the streets, shot, beaten, or run down. Thousands were arrested and processed through detention facilities that the Islamic Republic officially denied were operating at the scale that survivors later described. The Karazak Detention Center, south of Tehran, became a particular symbol of what the regime was willing to do to suppress the movement. Accounts from survivors and the families of those who did not survive described conditions and treatment that constituted systematic abuse. Even elements of the Iranian establishment, figures who had no sympathy for the Green Movement's political goals, found the methods used at Karazak difficult to defend. The facility was eventually shut down, and several low-level officials were prosecuted. The men who had ordered what happened there were not. On the streets of Tehran that summer, protesters who understood what was happening began chanting something that had never been chanted before in the history of the Islamic Republic. Not a slogan against the system in general, not a condemnation of a policy or a political outcome, a direct, personal warning aimed at a specific man whose name had, until very recently, barely registered in public consciousness. Mujtaba, they chanted. May you die and never become the leader. That slogan was not born from abstract political principle. It was born from what those protesters had seen in the streets.
the besiege in their uniforms, the arrest vans, the systematic organization of state violence against civilians, and from what they understood about who had organized it. A generation of Iranians who came of age in 2009 learned two things simultaneously: that the Islamic Republic was willing to crush them physically, and that the man most responsible for that decision was the one being quietly positioned to inherit the system that had just crushed them. The Green Movement was suppressed.
Not defeated in any ideological sense, the grievances that produced it did not disappear and would resurface repeatedly in the years that followed, most explosively in the protests of 2019 and 2022. But organizationally, in the streets, it was broken. The arrests, the intimidation, the systematic removal of its leadership from public life, all of it achieved the regime's immediate goal. The Islamic Republic survived 2009 intact, and Mujtaba Khamenei emerged from it with something he had never previously possessed: a demonstrated track record of operational effectiveness inside the state's most sensitive security functions. He had been tested. He had delivered. And the men inside the IRGC who had watched him coordinate the crackdown drew their own conclusions about his capabilities. Conclusions that would matter enormously 16 years later, when they needed to choose a new supreme leader in the middle of a war.
But 2009 was also the moment that changed how Western intelligence services thought about him. Because the crackdown had required coordination. Coordination required communication. And communication, even encrypted, even carefully protected, leaves traces that experienced signals intelligence agencies know how to find. The National Security Agency, working in close collaboration with its British counterpart GCHQ and sharing products with Mossad's Signals Intelligence Division, had been monitoring Iranian internal communications throughout the crisis. What they collected was fragmentary, as it always is, but the fragments pointed consistently in the same direction. After 2009, Mojtaba Khamenei was no longer simply a biographical footnote in Western intelligence files. He had a file of his own.
And that file would grow steadily over the following decade, fed by signals collection, by human reporting from inside the Iranian system, and by the financial investigations that would eventually produce some of the most revealing material about the man that any Western agency had ever assembled. Because alongside everything else, the military background, the seminary education, the operational role in state repression, Mujtaba Khamenei had spent years building something that had nothing to do with theology or security. He had built an empire, and it was hidden in plain sight, scattered across some of the most expensive real estate markets in the world. The United States Treasury Department sanctioned Mujtaba Khamenei on November 4, 2019, during Trump's first term as part of the administration's maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime. The designation was specific and carefully worded.
It stated that Mujtaba worked to advance his father's destabilizing regional ambitions and oppressive domestic objectives, and that he represented the supreme leader, despite never being elected or appointed to a government position aside from work in the office of his father. The Treasury's action was not a symbolic gesture. It was a legal finding based on intelligence assessments that this man was a primary operational figure in the Iranian state, not a peripheral family member, not a ceremonial presence, but a functional actor at the center of the regime's most consequential decisions. The sanctions froze any assets he held in American jurisdiction and prohibited American persons and entities from doing business with him. They were, in practical terms, largely symbolic, because Mujtaba Khamenei held no assets in American jurisdiction and conducted no business through channels that American sanctions could reach directly. The real significance of the designation was what it confirmed publicly, that the United States government had concluded, on the basis of classified intelligence, that this man was not a private citizen. He was a state actor, and he was operating a financial network designed specifically to insulate his assets
from exactly the kind of legal pressure that sanctions represent. That network, when Bloomberg eventually reconstructed its outlines in a year-long investigation published in January of 2026, was considerably more extensive than even experienced Iran analysts had expected to find. The reported holdings included more than a dozen luxury properties in London, valued collectively at over $138 million. Among them, a $46 million mansion that stood as one of the most expensive private residences in a city full of expensive private residences. There were upscale hotels in Frankfurt and on the Spanish island of Majorca,
a villa in Dubai, financial interests connected to shipping and banking relationships spread across Europe. The entire structure operated through a network of front companies and offshore accounts maintained in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and the United Arab Emirates, jurisdictions chosen for their combination of financial secrecy, legal stability, and distance from Iranian sovereign territory. His name appeared in none of the transactions. That was the point. The architecture of the network had been constructed precisely to ensure that no single document, no single financial record, no single corporate filing anywhere in the world would place Mujtaba Khamenei's name on an asset. Everything moved through intermediaries, individuals whose connection to the Khamenei family could be established through intelligence reporting, but whose paper trail led, by design, nowhere near the man at the center.
Bloomberg tied him to Ali Ansari, a financier whose bank Ayande had been forcibly dissolved by the Iranian state in late 2025 after it went bankrupt. The result, investigations found, of extending massive undisclosed loans to unnamed insiders who had no intention of repaying them. The dissolution of the bank had pushed Iran's already severe inflation higher, wiping out the savings of ordinary Iranian depositors, while the money had moved, through channels that investigators were still trying to trace at the time of the report, into the offshore network that served the interests of the regime's most powerful figures. Neither Mujtaba Khamenei nor Ansari had ever publicly addressed these allegations. The silence was consistent with everything else that defined Mujtaba's public presence, which was, in the most precise sense of the term, not a public presence at all. But here is what that financial empire revealed that went beyond the obvious fact of its existence.
It revealed something about Mujtaba Khamenei's relationship to the Islamic Republic itself, his understanding of its long-term durability, and his personal preparation for scenarios in which that durability might be tested.
A man who genuinely believed in the permanence and invincibility of the system he served does not spend years moving billions of dollars into real estate in London and financial accounts in Liechtenstein. A man who does that is hedging. He is building, with quiet and methodical precision, a position that does not depend entirely on the continued existence of the regime whose apparatus he controls. What that calculation says about his actual beliefs, about the Islamic Republic, about its future, about his own role within it, is a question that CIA analysts had been arguing about for years without reaching a consensus.
And it is one of the primary reasons that, when his name emerged as the frontrunner to succeed his father, the intelligence assessment that circulated in Washington was not confident. It was uncertain, in exactly the way that matters most when a country with a nuclear program and a war underway needs a new leader. Uncertain about what he would actually do. And somewhere in those classified assessments, buried between the financial data and the signals intelligence reports and the fragmentary human source reporting, was a single finding that concerned American analysts more than any other aspect of his profile: his position on nuclear weapons. That finding did not come from a single source. It never does in serious intelligence work. It came from the accumulated weight of multiple streams of reporting: signals intelligence intercepts, human source assessments, analysis of public statements made by the clerics and ideologues closest to Mujtaba Khamenei, and the behavioral record of decisions made inside the Beit Rabari during the periods when he was known to have exercised significant influence over its direction. The conclusion that those streams converged on was not comfortable. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had, throughout his 36 years as supreme leader,
maintained a carefully constructed ambiguity on the question of nuclear weapons. He had issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, declaring that the production and use of nuclear weapons was forbidden under Islamic law. Western governments had debated for years whether that fatwa represented a genuine theological commitment, a strategic posture designed to provide diplomatic cover while the program advanced, or something in between.
The debate was never resolved because the evidence was genuinely mixed. What was not ambiguous was that Ali Khamenei had, at critical junctures, chosen negotiation over escalation on the nuclear question, most notably in the negotiations that produced the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal that capped Iran's enrichment program in exchange for sanctions relief. His son held no such ambiguity, or at least, that was the assessment. According to analysis published by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in the days following Mujtaba's selection as supreme leader, the new leader and the IRGC commanders who had installed him might well decide that Iran should move quickly to obtain nuclear weapons, not as a long-term strategic aspiration, but as an immediate response to the military vulnerability that the American and Israeli strikes of February 28th had just demonstrated. The logic was not difficult to follow.
The strikes had killed the supreme leader inside his own compound, in the heart of his own capital, surrounded by his own elite guard. They had decapitated the senior military and security leadership. They had destroyed large portions of Iran's air defense network and struck multiple nuclear facilities. And they had done all of it in a single operational window, with a precision and scale that Iran's defenses had been entirely unable to counter. For anyone inside the Iranian system drawing conclusions from that experience, the lesson was stark. Conventional military power had not protected the Islamic Republic. Air defenses had not protected it. The proxy network had not protected it. The one thing that might have protected it, the one thing that had kept North Korea inviolable despite its poverty and isolation and the hostility of every major power surrounding it, was a nuclear weapon. A demonstrated, deliverable nuclear capability that made the cost of any military strike against the regime's leadership too high for any adversary to accept. Mujtaba Khamenei's ideological formation pointed toward exactly that conclusion. His mentor, Mesbah Yazdi, had been one of the most outspoken advocates within the Iranian clerical establishment for the position that Iran not only had the right to develop nuclear weapons, but had a positive obligation to do so. That the survival of the Islamic Republic was itself a religious imperative that overrode the constraints of international law or diplomatic convention. Mujtaba had studied under this man. He had embraced his framework, and the IRGC commanders who had pressed the assembly of experts to select him as supreme leader were themselves the custodians of the ballistic missile program and the enriched uranium stockpile that, by early 2026, stood closer to weapons-grade capability than at any previous point in the program's history. The combination, a new supreme leader ideologically predisposed toward weaponization, IRGC commanders with both the capability and the motivation to accelerate, and a freshly demonstrated vulnerability that made the case for deterrence more compelling than ever, was what American analysts in Washington were trying to model in the days after March 8th. And their models were not producing reassuring outputs. But before any of that could unfold, before Mujtaba Khamenei could make any decision about anything, he first had to survive the process that would put him in power.
And that process, in the specific circumstances of early March 2026, was one of the most extraordinary and legally fraught succession events in the history of any modern state. The Iranian constitution is explicit on the question of succession. When a supreme leader dies or is incapacitated, authority passes temporarily to a leadership council composed of the president, the head of the judiciary, and a member of the Guardian Council, while the Assembly of Experts convenes to select a permanent successor. The Assembly of Experts is an 88-member body of senior Shia clerics elected by the Iranian public every 8 years. It holds, under the constitution, the sole authority to select and, if necessary, remove the supreme leader.
Its deliberations are supposed to be conducted through a process of theological consultation and consensus building that reflects the Islamic Republic's foundational claim to religious legitimacy. None of that process was available in early March of 2026. The Assembly of Experts was attempting to function while the country it governed was under active military bombardment. Many of its most senior members were in shock, cut off from normal communications, or physically unable to travel to participate in any in-person deliberation. The candidates who might, under normal circumstances, have emerged through a genuine process of consultation and consensus, senior clerics with real theological authority and substantial followings within the religious establishment, were themselves navigating the chaos of a state in crisis. And hovering over the entire process, with a directness that made a mockery of the constitutional formalities, was the IRGC. According to reporting by Iran International, which had the most detailed sourcing on the internal dynamics of the succession process, IRGC commanders began making direct contact with members of the Assembly of Experts in the hours and days following Ali Khamenei's death. The contacts were not subtle. They were described by Assembly members who spoke to Iranian diaspora media as repeated, insistent, and carrying the unmistakable weight of an institution that controlled the country's military forces, making its preference known to a body of clerics who had no military force of their own. The pressure was for Mujtaba, not for Ali Reza Arafi, a senior cleric who had been named to the Interim Leadership Council and who had stronger theological credentials, not for Hassan Khomeini, the grandson of the Islamic Republic's founder, who carried a symbolic legitimacy that no other candidate could match. Not for any of the figures that Ali Khamenei himself had reportedly floated in private conversations as potential successors, men with actual administrative experience and recognized religious standing. For Mujtaba, the son, the man who had never held an official position, the man who lacked even the clerical rank that the Constitution specified as a requirement for the Supreme Leader's office. The online session of the Assembly on March 3rd was described by members who participated in it as unlike any deliberative process they had experienced. Those who raised objections to Mujtaba's candidacy on the grounds of his insufficient religious rank, his lack of administrative experience, the constitutional impropriety of hereditary succession in a system founded explicitly on the rejection of dynastic rule, were given limited time to speak. Discussion was cut off before it reached any natural conclusion. The atmosphere, in the words of one member cited by Iranian diaspora sources, was unnatural. The vote was held before a genuine consensus had been reached, and then, as if to underscore the extraordinary circumstances in which all of this was occurring, Israeli strikes hit the Assembly of Experts' own office building in the city of Qom. Not during the online session of March 3rd, but in the days that followed, as the count was still being processed and the formal announcement was still being prepared. The message that strike sent, whether or not it was intended as a message, was one that every member of the Assembly understood without being told. The process of selecting a new leader was itself taking place under the threat of elimination, and speed was not merely a political preference, but a matter of physical survival. By March 6th, two candidates were described as remaining in serious contention, and both, according to Parliament member Mohsen Zanganeh, were reportedly reluctant to accept the position. That reluctance was not difficult to understand. Whoever became the supreme leader of Iran on that date was inheriting a country at war, a nuclear program under bombardment, an economy in freefall, and the explicit public promise from both the American president and the Israeli military that any successor to Ali Khamenei would be considered a legitimate target for elimination. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, had stated on March 4th, 4 days before the formal announcement, that Khamenei's successor, no matter his identity, would face the same fate as his predecessor. Trump, in an interview with ABC News, said the new leader was not going to last long without American approval. These were not abstract diplomatic signals. They were explicit statements of lethal intent, directed at whoever accepted a specific job. The reluctance of candidates to take it was, in that context, rational. On the evening of March 8th, the Assembly of Experts issued its formal statement. Mujtaba Khamenei had been selected as the third supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran by what the assembly described as a decisive vote. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, declared the appointment the beginning of a new era of dignity and strength. The IRGC issued a statement pledging full obedience to the new commander-in-chief. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Mujtaba's longtime political ally and one of the figures he had financed and supported over years of behind-the-scenes political work, welcomed the appointment as a religious and national duty.
The Armed Forces Defense Council stated, with a formality that carried the weight of an oath, that they would obey the commander-in-chief until the last drop of their blood. And one assembly member, asked to explain why the body had chosen a man that Ali Khamenei himself had reportedly never formally endorsed, offered the most revealing justification of all. Mujtaba Khamenei had been chosen, the member said, based on the late supreme leader's own principle, that Iran's top leader should be hated by the enemy rather than praised by it. Even the great Satan, the member noted, had mentioned his name. Trump had called him unacceptable. And in the logic of the Islamic Republic in wartime, that condemnation from Washington was not a liability. It was a credential. Outside Iran, the reactions arrived with a speed that reflected how much the world had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment.
Trump, who had spent the preceding week making increasingly direct statements about the succession, telling reporters at one point that the strikes had been so successful they had knocked out most of the candidates, and that second or third place is dead, responded to the announcement with the bluntness that had defined his entire approach to the Iran crisis. He said the new supreme leader would need to get approval from the United States. He said that without that approval, the new leader was not going to last long. He did not specify what approval would require or what not lasting long would look like in practice. Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most vocal congressional supporters of the military operation, was more direct. He said on the social media platform X that Mujtaba Khamenei was not the change the United States was looking for, and that it was only a matter of time before he met the same fate as his father.
Israel's military restated its position without elaboration. Any successor to Khamenei would be pursued. Netanyahu said in a press conference that he sought to destabilize the regime and enable change, a statement that left deliberately ambiguous whether the change he was enabling was a reformed Islamic Republic or no Islamic Republic at all. Russia's President Vladimir Putin pledged unwavering support for the new supreme leader. China's government stated its opposition to any targeting of Mujtaba Khamenei and called for an immediate ceasefire. Both governments moved quickly, in private channels, to open lines of communication with whoever appeared to be consolidating authority in Tehran. And somewhere inside Iran, in a location that no Western intelligence service had been able to confirm, Mujtaba Khamenei himself was watching all of this unfold. He had not appeared publicly since February 28th. He had not given a speech, issued a statement in his own voice, or been photographed since the war began. His mother had survived the initial strike, only to die from her injuries on March 2nd, 2 days after the compound was destroyed. His wife, Zahra Haddad Adel, had been killed in the rubble of the compound on the morning of February 28th, along with one of their sons. He had survived because he had not been there. And now the question that every intelligence agency in the world was trying to answer, the question that determined whether the war in Iran would escalate or eventually find a path toward some kind of resolution, was not whether Mujtaba Khamenei was the supreme leader. He was. The question was what this particular man, with this particular history, this particular worldview, and this particular set of losses, was going to do with the power he now held. There is a specific kind of danger that intelligence analysts call a black box problem. It is not the danger of a known adversary whose intentions are clear and whose behavior can be modeled with some degree of confidence. It is the danger of a figure whose internal logic,
whose actual beliefs, whose real priorities, whose genuine red lines cannot be reliably reconstructed from the available evidence. A known adversary can be deterred, negotiated with, or confronted on the basis of what you understand about him. A black box cannot. You cannot deter a man whose decision-making calculus you cannot read. You cannot negotiate with a figure whose actual bottom line you cannot locate. You can only watch and wait and try to anticipate. Mujtaba Khamenei was, on March 8, 2026, the most consequential black box in the world. The war that had produced his succession was, by the second week of March, reshaping the material reality of the region faster than any diplomatic framework could absorb.
Oil had surged past $100 a barrel for the first time in years, the market's immediate verdict on the closure of Iranian export capacity and the threat to Gulf shipping routes. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes daily, had seen tanker traffic fall to a near standstill as shipping companies refused to risk vessels in waters where Iranian naval forces and Houthi-linked assets were operating under conditions of active conflict. G7 finance ministers were in emergency consultation about coordinated releases from strategic petroleum reserves. The economic consequences of a prolonged conflict in the Gulf were no longer theoretical projections. They were arriving in real time, in fuel prices and freight costs and supply chain disruptions, in every economy connected to global energy markets, which meant every economy on Earth. Inside Iran, the immediate physical effects of the strikes were still being assessed.
The enrichment facilities at Natanz had sustained significant damage. The Fordow site, carved into a mountain near Qom, had been struck by the American B-2s carrying the massive ordnance penetrator, the only weapon in the combined arsenal capable of reaching its deeply buried centrifuge halls. The uranium conversion facility at Isfahan had been destroyed. The IRGC's ballistic missile storage and launch infrastructure had been targeted across the country. The air defense network had been effectively dismantled in the first wave of the operation. Iran's oil infrastructure, which the country depended on for the hard currency that funded everything from the military to basic state services, had been struck by Israeli aircraft in the early days of March, sending a thick plume of black smoke across Tehran that was visible from satellite imagery published by news organizations around the world. The Islamic Republic was not destroyed. Its institutions, battered, decapitated at the top, operating under bombardment, continued to function in the degraded way that large bureaucratic systems continue to function, even after catastrophic shocks. Soldiers remained at their posts. State television continued broadcasting. The currency collapsed, but the banking system did not entirely stop. The IRGC's surviving operational commanders maintained enough coherence to conduct the retaliatory missile strikes against American installations across the Gulf, and to continue supplying whatever remained of Iran's proxy networks with direction and, where possible, materiel. But the Iran that existed on March 9th was not the Iran that had existed on February 27th. It was a country that had been struck at the center of its power in a way it had never been struck before, and was now being led by a man who had never, in any formal sense, led anything. The question of what Mujtaba Khamenei would actually do with that leadership was, in the first days of his tenure, unanswerable. Not because analysts lacked information, but because the answer depended on variables that the available information could not resolve. The first variable was the simplest and most immediate. Would he negotiate, or would he escalate? The case for negotiation was real, and the pressures producing it were structural. Iran's nuclear infrastructure had been struck. Its air defenses were gone. Its oil revenue was collapsing. Its military had demonstrated in the opening days of the war that it lacked the capability to meaningfully contest American and Israeli air power over its own territory. The retaliatory missile strikes had caused damage at American installations across the Gulf, but had not achieved the strategic outcome that would have changed the equation.
forcing an American military withdrawal from the region. And Iran now faced the additional burden of a new supreme leader, whose legitimacy was contested within his own establishment, whose clerical credentials were insufficient by the Constitution's own standards, and whose selection had been driven by IRGC pressure rather than genuine theological consensus. Against all of that, the case for negotiation was straightforward. The Islamic Republic needed breathing room to reconstitute, and the only way to get it was through some form of diplomatic engagement. But Mujtaba Khamenei was not a man whose profile pointed toward compromise. Everything in his formation, the hardline theology of Mesbah Yazdi, the operational culture of the IRGC, where he had built his networks, the 2009 crackdown that had established his reputation as a man who responded to pressure with force rather than concession, argued in the other direction. And there was something else, something that the analysts trying to model his decision-making kept returning to, because it was the one element of his situation that had no clear analytical precedent. His family had been killed in the strike of February 28th. His mother, Mansoura Khojasta Bagazada, who survived the initial strike, only to die from her injuries 3 days later on March 2nd. His wife, Zahra Haddad Adel, the daughter of Ghulam Ali Haddad Adel, a senior conservative politician who had served as chairman of parliament and remained one of the most influential figures in Iran's clerical political establishment. A woman who had shared his life through the decades of his rise inside the regime's inner circles. And one of their sons. All of them killed in the rubble of the Pasteur Street compound. And Mujtaba himself. Iranian state television, upon announcing his selection as supreme leader, referred to him as Janbaz, wounded by the enemy in the Ramadan War. It did not elaborate. He had not been present at the compound when the strike landed, but he had not emerged from the opening days of the war unscathed. Mujtaba Khamenei had survived only because he had not been present, and he was now the supreme leader of a country at war with the forces that had killed them. Intelligence analysts are trained to be careful about attributing emotional motivation to state actors. Decisions made at the level of strategic leadership are supposed to be driven by interest calculation, by institutional pressure, by the logic of the security environment, not by personal grief or personal rage. That discipline exists for good reason. States are not individuals. Their decisions are shaped by bureaucratic processes, by competing institutional interests, by the constraints of capability and resources that tend to moderate the influence of any single leader's emotional state on actual policy outcomes. But discipline is not the same as certainty. And the honest assessment, the one that the most experienced Iran analysts were sharing in private conversations in Washington and Tel Aviv and London in the days after March 8th, was that the combination of factors now present in Mujtaba Khamenei's situation created a scenario with no reliable historical precedent for calibration. A new leader, an illegitimate succession by the standards of his own system, a country under active bombardment, a nuclear program that had been struck but not destroyed, an ideology that pointed toward weaponization, a personal loss of extraordinary scale, and an adversary, the United States and Israel, that had publicly announced its intention to kill him if he did not meet conditions that no Iranian supreme leader had ever accepted from a foreign power. The conditions Trump had articulated, that the new leader would need American approval, that without it he would not last long, were not, in any realistic diplomatic reading, an opening for negotiation. They were an ultimatum that had been worded specifically to be unacceptable to any Iranian leader who intended to remain one. Because a supreme leader who publicly acknowledged that his tenure required the approval of the American president had, in the logic of the Islamic Republic, already ceased to function as a supreme leader. The system's foundational claim was independence from exactly that kind of external authority. Accepting it, even implicitly, even through back channels, would have demolished what remained of the regime's legitimacy faster than any American bomb. Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf had understood this when he responded to Trump's demands by writing that the fate of Iran would be determined solely by the proud Iranian nation, not by what he called Epstein's gang, a formulation crude enough to play well domestically and sharp enough to signal that the regime had no intention of engaging with the framing Trump had established. The IRC commanders who had installed Mujtaba understood it. The assembly members who had voted for him, under pressure and under bombardment, understood it. And Mujtaba himself, who had spent his entire adult life inside a system built around the premise that external pressure required defiance rather than accommodation, understood it most clearly of all. What he had not yet shown was what that defiance would look like in practice, whether it would take the form of accelerated nuclear development, calculating that the deterrent value of a weapon outweighed the risk of the strikes that pursuing it would invite,
whether it would take the form of reconstituting the proxy network, rebuilding the relationships with Hezbollah's remnants, with Iraqi Shia factions, with whatever remained of the Houthi military infrastructure in Yemen, to restore some version of the strategic depth that the preceding 18 months had stripped away. Whether it would take the form of some back-channel signal to Moscow or Beijing, seeking the kind of external patronage that might provide diplomatic cover for a negotiated pause in the conflict without requiring the formal concessions that a direct engagement with Washington would demand. Or whether it would take a form that no analyst had fully modeled. Something unexpected, driven by a man whose actual decision-making logic had never been publicly tested, in circumstances that no one had previously imagined he would face.
The Israeli military, operating on the assumption that uncertainty was itself a threat, gave its position in operational rather than diplomatic terms. It needed 3 more weeks, a senior officer told NPR on the day of Mujtaba's selection, to accomplish the goal of destroying Iran's military forces. Israel was fighting, the officer said, as if every day of the war could be the last, because what Trump decided could change the parameters of the operation at any moment, and the window for achieving decisive military results might close before the military objectives were complete. That tension between the Israeli military's operational timeline and the American president's political calculus was itself one of the defining uncertainties of the moment. Trump had authorized the operation. He had declared it a success. He had confirmed Khamenei's death from the White House lawn, but he had also, in the days that followed, begun making statements that suggested his appetite for an extended military campaign was not unlimited. His comment that the new regime had reached out to negotiate, confirmed publicly by Fox News on the day of the succession announcement, indicated that some form of back-channel contact was already underway, even as the bombs continued falling. What those contacts contained, what conditions were being explored, what any realistic path to an end of the conflict might look like, none of that was public. It was happening, if it was happening at all, in exactly the kind of invisible channels that had always been Mujtaba Khamenei's preferred operating environment. The back corridors, the indirect communications, the decisions made before they ever formally arrived for announcement. The man who had spent his entire adult life accumulating power through invisibility was now navigating the most visible crisis of any Iranian leader since the revolution of 1979. He was doing it from an undisclosed location. He was doing it without appearing in public, without speaking, without allowing himself to be seen or heard by the country he now led or the world that was watching him. His first act as supreme leader was the same as his defining characteristic across 30 years of political life. He remained invisible. Whether that invisibility was tactical, a security precaution in a country still under bombardment by forces that had explicitly promised to kill him, or whether it reflected something deeper about how he intended to exercise power, was a question that the intelligence agencies tracking him could not yet answer. The CIA did not know where he was. Mossad did not know where he was.
The satellites that had mapped his father's compound in such precise detail, that had tracked the behavioral patterns that made the February 28th strike possible, had not yet located the third supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. He was out there, somewhere, in possession of the codes, the networks, the institutional authority, and, the personal motivation to shape what came next in a region already transformed beyond recognition in the span of 9 days. The world that had existed before February 28th was gone. In the ruins of the one that replaced it, a man nobody had heard speak was now the most consequential figure in the most volatile region on Earth. And he was watching, waiting, calculating, exactly as he always had.